Welcome to this bite-sized webinar, the fifth in a series of 6 webinars intended to provide you with some ideas, models and practical tools that you can use to support your resilience and well-being over the coming weeks. Once again, I'm joined by my colleague Damien Wonfor. We both work as executive coaches, and resilience is one of the areas that we find ourselves working with our clients quite a lot of the time. So the approaches that we've been sharing with you and will share with you today are very much taken from the tools and the frameworks that we use with our clients that they find helpful. If you're able to listen into the last webinar, we focused on the impact of optimism on how we see the world and the physical and psychological impact of having more of an appreciative lens through which we experience our work, the people around us and our lives. In today's session, we want to focus on self-compassion, taking some time to shine a light on how we talk to ourselves and exploring how we can show ourselves the same kindness that we often show to others. So as before, we're going to invite you to have a pen and paper ready. We will take some time during the course of this short webinar just to give you a moment to pause and reflect. Often we're so busy supporting others that we actually stop noticing how we're relating to ourselves and the impact that it has on us. I just want to share with you a Native American wisdom story, which tells of an old Cherokee who is teaching his grandson about life. "A fight is going on inside me," he said to the boy. "It's a terrible fight, and it is between 2 wolves. One is evil. He is anger, envy, sorrow, regret, greed, arrogance, self-pity, guilt, resentment, inferiority, lies, false pride, superiority, and ego. The other is good. He is joy, peace, love, hope, serenity, humility, kindness, benevolence, empathy, generosity, truth, compassion, and faith. The same fight is going on inside you and inside every other person too." The grandson thought about it for a minute and then asked his grandfather, "Which wolf will win?" The old Cherokee simply replied, "The one you feed." So the first thing we really want to invite you to do is to start noticing your own inner voice and to be conscious about not only what it says, but also how it says it, the tone and the energy that it uses when it's talking to you. So on this next slide, you're going to see an idea from Tim Galway. And Tim Galway was both a semi-professional tennis player and also a Harvard professor. And his way of conceptualizing this sort of inner part of us, this inner voice, which we all have, was to describe it as a self-1 and a self-2. And he said we all have this self-1, which is the loud inner voice or the critic or the judge. And it's the part of us that is more anxious, that tries too hard, that often doubts ourselves, that can be quite a perfectionist, that can make us feel uptight and angry and tense. And equally, we all have a self-2. And the self-2 is this quiet inner voice of trust and belief in oneself and one's own potential. And when we're experiencing our self-2, we're much more present in the moment. We're much calmer. We often experience this sense of being in flow, of relaxed concentration. So if you've ever had a moment or moments where time just passes and you're just doing what you do, then that is your self-2 at work. And you'll see at the bottom that both self-1 and self-2 are trying to serve us. So the invitation here is not to try and get rid of your self-1. There is a reason for it to be there. It is really trying to serve you. And actually often people describe the self-1 as the part of us that is trying to encourage us to grow or learn or be the best we can. And of course, we don't want to get rid of the opportunity to improve. The important thing is to understand how a corrosive inner dialogue impacts our emotional climate our creative ability and our mood. The reality is that when this is our inner dialogue and it has that tone, we're operating from a position of a stress-induced cocktail, really, that makes it hard for us to do balanced, objective thinking. So again, the invitation is to be more conscious about this voice that we have, the voice of the inner critic, and to try and have a slightly different relationship with it. I just wanted to share with you an example, because one of the coaches that I work with started to say to her inner critic when it appeared, "Oh, hello, it's you again. I know you're trying to help me, but I don't need you right now." So again, just a lighter way of acknowledging that it's there and trying to have a different conversation with it.
So we're just going to build now on a bit of reflection. And I want you to think about a work scenario that you had recently, perhaps where you were discussing some results, perhaps something that you've completed or something that you've done. And I want you to imagine that you're having a conversation with your peers, and rather than supporting you, they judge you harshly, they criticize you. And I just want you to imagine that's playing out for yourself and just notice how it feels. So just imagine what that experience would be like. Because it's the same with this inner voice, this inner critic. And Professor Paul Gilbert, who's written a lot about self-compassion, he describes this self-criticism as part of the human monitoring system. And as we looked on the last session, we have a negativity bias, so we often go to what's missing. But the key thing here is this inner dialogue, and as Liz just expressed it as corrosive dialogue, we know that it triggers the threat system. And in a way, we're ending up fighting and beating ourselves up in these situations. So if you imagine the same scenario, you're reflecting on a recent situation at work and you're discussing with some peers, and just imagine that they're supporting and encouraging you as you work through, perhaps it's a difficult situation that you experienced. And again, it's just a moment of pausing. What would that be like? What would that feel? How do you imagine that would impact your energy? Because this is really what we're leaning into in this webinar, these practices of self-compassion, which we're going to explore in a moment. Instead of triggering our threat system, the fight or flight, they're triggering our soothing system. So if you've watched a webinar 1 around our emotional systems, this is really triggering that green emotional system where we start to experience feelings of calm and contentment. So in difficulty and in a difficult situation, where would you consciously like to go? And this is the challenge for us, because we know that a proportion of our day, for an average 47% of our waking hours, if we look at the studies, we're usually on autopilot. So, being self-compassionate is a challenge in itself, especially when we're in a busy doing phase, we're under a lot of pressure, which, is our constant experience at the moment. So learning to be self-compassionate is a challenge in itself. But as we've seen from that scenario, it can have a very different impact on our resilience and well-being. And so Kristin Neff and also Christopher Germer have written a lot about self-compassion and even developed a self-compassion training. And Kristin describes self-compassion and has having these 3 components. And I'm just going to take you through them. So the first aspect of self-compassion is self-kindness. And it's just what we've been speaking about throughout this session. We talk to ourselves in the same way that we would our best friend or a loved one or a child. If one of our children, was upset, had a difficulty, how would we like to be with them? And it's the idea that we bring the same attitude to ourselves. The second component of self-compassion is common humanity. So compassion means to suffer with. And, it's the idea that the human experience, so being human, is imperfect. And the realization that, if the human experience is imperfect, everybody will feel like this. And the final piece of self-compassion or component is mindfulness. And again, if we're on autopilot for a large proportion of our day, it can be really hard to recognize the difficulty that we're experiencing. So mindfulness means present moment attention. We're fully aware of what we're experiencing, and most importantly, how we're relating to that experience. So if we bring mindfulness to our experience, we're seeing what is happening in a non-judgmental way. And therefore, we're choosing to give ourselves this self-compassion. And as I said earlier, to realize that to do that, we must first realize that this is happening. So how do we actually do this in practice? And one of the ways that we encourage our coaching clients to show themselves self-compassion is actually to use a self-soothing gesture. So if you're in a private space at the moment while you're listening to this, just try placing a hand on your heart and perhaps just alternate the pressure. So there's a sense of the contact that makes. So this is one self-soothing gesture. Another one can be actually giving ourselves a hug. It could be putting our hands on our arms in a hugging gesture and actually rubbing our arms. But let's just stay with the hand on the heart. So we know, again, from the research that's been carried out in these self-soothing gestures, that these increase the feelings of calm and trust. And most importantly, they reduce cardiovascular stress. So by placing a hand on the heart, the first step is really this mindfulness. So we realize that we're suffering. So we can say to ourselves, this is a moment of stress, or this is really hard right now. We bring common humanity, with a saying to ourselves like, anyone would feel like this in this situation. Anyone would feel stressed. Anyone would find this challenging. And then we bring the self-kindness. So we could say to ourselves, this is really hard. I know I can get through this. Or it may be, this is really hard for me right now. What's the best way I can take care of myself? So these moments of self-compassion can have a profound impact on our ability to respond to the events in our life rather than to be habitually and unconsciously reacting to them. So we could say that this will move us from a reactive state to a more conscious, responsive state. So thinking about self-compassion, this may be an exercise you want to just experiment with. Just some other questions for you to reflect on. So in a moment of difficulty, just thinking about this conversation, how can you demonstrate kindness towards yourself? So in that moment of stress, how could you do this? The same thing you do for a best friend, a loved one, a child. The second question, if you were to act in a more gentle way towards yourself, what would you do? How would you talk to yourself? If you were to comfort yourself, how could you do that in a gesture? And a final reflective question, you know, is if someone else were in this situation that I am in, how would I act towards them? Now, could I behave in the same way to myself? So we really hope that this is going to spark a period of experimentation for you. As the quote on the screen from Louise Hay says, you've been criticizing yourself for years and it hasn't worked. Try approving of yourself and see what happens.
Thank you for listening. We hope you'll be able to join us for the final webinar in this series, which is all about seeing the bigger picture.